The topic from the almanac for this week is right view. And as I was considering the topic of right view, which is one of the steps of the Buddhist Eightfold Path, I was reminded of this idea of viewing, not just a right view, not just one right view. I mean, if we're talking about gems from the wisdom traditions with an S on the end, that means there are different viewpoints that can all be very helpful. And a passage that I was reading is called Plasticity of Imagination. And it talks about the sculptor and how a sculptor needs to view his piece from many different angles as he's working on the piece that he is sculpting. Also, a sculptor has to have an inner vision of that piece that he's working on to kind of get some sense of what it really is all about, as well as these different external perspectives. So I thought, wow, that's such a great analogy. Do I know any sculptors that could speak to us today? And sure enough, I do. And his name is Christopher Edwards, and he's been living here on island for many years. He is someone who sculpts in clay, and he does different ceramic art forms. And he's also someone that I've had wonderful conversations with in groups in the past. So I thought, how perfect. Let's invite Chris to give us just a little presentation at the beginning about his experience from the sculpting tradition, which is a quite venerable tradition, about inner and outer perspective, perhaps, what this idea of viewpoint might mean to a sculptor. Why don't you pass it over to Chris, if you would?
Yeah.
Well, hi there. Am I on?
You are.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thank you, Renee, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, as Renee mentioned, I'm an artist. I make sculptural ceramics that are mostly based on the geometry of nature. And I have to say up front that I really don't know very much about Buddhist thought, but my understanding of right view is that it means seeing things as they really are, which I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I guess it's part of my job as an artist. You know, my goal is to make things that are pleasing to me and hopefully pleasing to other people as well. But when I'm working, and Renee mentioned that sort of inner vision that you're working towards, I find it surprisingly hard to see something clearly that I'm working on. You know, is it good? Does it please me? Is it working? This is probably the most difficult part of the whole process of being a sculptor for me. My work is really time intensive. It takes a long time. There's a lot of steps involved and a lot of details. And just trying to see the thing clearly is the thing that takes up the majority of my time. And that often disappoints people. They ask me, how long did it take to make that? And I say, well, actually making it took about, 20% of the time. The rest of the time was trying to figure out what to make or, why to make something. But they don't seem to appreciate that as much as the hands-on work. So my feeling is that this idea of how to, when I'm working on something and I'm trying to see it clearly, this is probably a good analog to the idea of right view. And so I was just going to talk about a couple of examples of things where I have, you know, I struggle to actually see something for what it really is. You know, you get very into something and you get too much history and too much thought in something, and then it can be very hard to see it clearly. So I was just going to talk about a couple of specific examples, and then talk about some strategies that I use. If you all are artists, you probably know these already, but does that sound like a good plan? Everybody on board?
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
Good.
So I just wanted to talk. So there was this is one specific example where I was working on a piece. I had maybe 100 hours in it, put a lot of effort into it. It finally came out of the kiln. I liked it, but it felt like it was lacking something. So I decided to add a little element to it, basically a little shiny element. I added some gold leaf to the piece. And as soon as I was finished adding this gold leaf, I set the piece aside, and my immediate thought was like, oh no, I have just totally fucked this up. It looked totally wrong. It looked awful. So I just, you know, and I'm not a dramatic person. So, but this is how I felt. I couldn't see it for what it was. So I put it aside, and, you know, resisted the urge to break it into a million pieces. And then over the course of a couple of days, I started to see it in a different light and started to like it. And I think I was just used to this one way of looking at it. And then suddenly when it changed, I couldn't see it anymore. And I needed some time to see it a little bit better. And that piece ended up being one of my favorite pieces I've ever made. It was acquired by the Honolulu Museum. So it's not just my favorite, they liked it too. So it's just interesting that my perception of what is in front of me can be so wildly wrong. Another example is when you open up the kiln. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with the ceramic process, but with a glaze firing, there's a lot of variables that go into it, and you don't have very much control over what happens inside of the kiln and how the piece turns out. Sometimes there's some magic, sometimes there's not. But inevitably, when I open up the kiln, you know, I have all of these preconceptions of what I want the piece to look like. And of course, it doesn't look anything like that, or in most cases, it doesn't when I open the kiln. And there's always this sense of disappointment. And over time, I've learned to just put it aside and wait a couple of days. And almost always, I end up finding that I like it better, or that it goes somewhere that I wasn't expecting. So there are many, many examples of this sort of thing where I need some way to give myself a little bit of distance to see something clearly. So some of those strategies that I've used. So I'm not trained as an artist, by the way. So I was trained as a graphic designer. So this is somewhat new to me, and over the past 7 years, I've tried to figure out some of these things. But the first rule is to give it some time. When something is new, you can't really see it very clearly. So unfortunately for ceramics, sometimes you don't have the luxury because it's drying quickly, you know, as you're making the thing. So you have a limited amount of time. And another strategy is what I call the sideways look, which is I try and look at it out of the side of my eye, not directly, and often it helps to look at it from far away and walk away from it and come back and look at it. And sometimes that helps break these preconceptions that have built up around what I'm looking at. And another trick is to just turn the thing upside down. A painter friend of mine told me about this. So when she's working on a painting and is trying to evaluate it, she will just take the whole painting and turn it upside down. And that breaks this set of preconceptions and allows her to see it just as a thing and not as a thing with a ton of history to it. And then another technique I use is to look at what I'm working on through a camera lens. So I just get out my iPhone and look at it, and somehow that little bit of a distance of seeing it on a screen instead of sitting in front of you gives me that somehow I don't know, maybe it takes away some of the details or it shifts its perspective slightly, but that often helps me figure out what it is that is maybe not working about a piece and how to fix it. Let's see, one other technique is to show it to someone else and often and get their opinion. And often I may not agree with their opinion. In fact, it's better if I don't, because somehow that makes it more real when you show it to someone else and they give you an opinion and I can say, no, that's, I don't agree with you at all. And that helps clarify what I want or what I'm thinking. And then there's just one other thing I wanted to mention is the idea of flow state. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but in the creative or productive world, that's a lot of people talk about being in a state of flow when things are just effortless and easy. So I find that can be very hard to get into, but I love it when it does happen. And it feels like you're not really even looking at something. You're just making something. Your hands are just, the energy is flowing through your hands, and you're not looking at it too hard. You're not judging it. You're just doing it. And so, that is a state where I feel I can get to the fastest way to get something to something that is good. But interestingly, it has to do with not looking at it and not judging it and just being with it. At some level, we all know that seeing is subjective, and it can vary quite a bit depending on your context and situation. But until I started doing the sculpture, I really had no idea how radically my perceptions can change and how quickly and how far off base I can be looking at, the same object, just, with a subtle difference of time or a different viewpoint can change it totally. And I guess that is, I think that's all I want to say at this moment. Can we open it up to conversation?
Excellent. Thank you ever so much. Wow.
I hope it wasn't too basic, but that's the realm that I live in. So I hope it can be extended. Some of those ideas can be extended into the more philosophical things that you talk about at this gathering.
Well, and we are all coming from different perspectives being here. So getting a very hands-on artistic perspective gives another viewpoint.
Right.
And I like the idea of opening it up now. And there are people here who have done certainly more study from the Buddhist perspective and this idea of right view. And it might be helpful for somebody who feels as if they can speak to that just a little bit, and then we can kind of go back and forth between. So I see Kirk's on our screen now, and he's the one who gave us the discussion of the life of the Buddha a couple weeks back. Do you want to say anything about right view from a Buddhist perspective, Kirk?
Well, I just want to thank Chris for his comments, because I also have an art background. I studied studio art in school at the university, and one of my favorite things was sculpture. And I ended up becoming an architect after school, kind of discovered architecture after school, but I still love to draw, and I haven't done any sculpture for a very long time, but it's one of my hidden loves was doing sculpture. And in fact, architecture is a kind of sculpture. And there's many connections occurred to me as you were speaking, Christopher, and but linking it up to, just as for starters, one of the things you mentioned about engaging someone who has a very different perspective from your own in looking at a piece reminded me of the Buddhist tradition, particularly in the what's called the Gelugpa school, which is Northern Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, that the Dalai Lama belongs to, where they have this, part of that tradition is this long training before they get into deeper attempts at meditative engagement with the ideas. There's this very long training in learning the sutras, in learning the philosophy under teachers who are masters of it, and engaging with fellow students in debates on philosophy, on the most basic points and the most deepest, most difficult points, and the part of that engagement, that debate engagement, is being challenged to both in flexibility of perspective and also in clarifying perspective, right? So when someone comes at you with a challenge that's, well, you're saying this, but you know what? It actually looks like this, or this is the real meaning of this text. If you follow it logically, this is the real meaning. So how but you're saying this other thing, so prove to me how, what is your reasoning there? So that's the kind of challenge that is engaged in on a weekly and daily basis, and it's that. Yeah.
May I ask, is this one I've seen them do? They like clap and go like this to each other.
Right.
Answer question.
Yes.
That's that one.
Yeah. Yes. They're being challenged on the fundamental perspectives that are offered in the teaching, which they've been memorizing texts, right? And they've been engaging with those texts, studying them carefully, and trying to articulate them themselves. And then they get challenged in debate in real time, right? And that's it's a progressive process where the Dalai Lama, in his first book, which was called My Land, My People, which I would hands down recommend to everyone. It's a very beautiful book. It talks about how he was first discovered to be the Dalai Lama as a baby, just a young child, and then the training he went through as a young person, and then as adult, and the fleeing from Tibet, and then also when he was going for his final degree, which is the most elevated within that tradition, where he's being challenged to recite texts, very long texts that have been memorized, not only forwards but backwards. And he can be stopped at any point and asked to reverse direction in terms of the recitation. But then there's also the debate part of it, where the most learned lamas are challenging him on the most obscure philosophical points within the tradition. And so anyway, it just reminded me of that part of that whole development of right view is being challenged and gaining both flexibility of perspective, but also insight. So you have to, part of what's being developed is you're clarifying what it is that you understand, and have to be able to defend it from within, not just by citing the text, but giving the logic and the reasoning behind it. So anyway, that's just for starters.
Thank you.
For me, Chris, I loved what you shared. I took notes because our country is so divided right now, and there's so many people that are so staunch at what they believe that there's no communication. And to really work with the idea of how can we look at things differently? How can we be, what I liked about Kirk that you said, is being flexible and challenge your insights. And so many people are so stuck in their view, whether right or left or whatever. And to be able to give it time, to look at it in different ways, to look with a little distance, to challenge our perception, to look at our perspective. Those were insights which you gave so beautifully in terms of your ceramic, but it really is what our life is about. And for me, right view is really how do I, the balance between believing in something and seeing it as the right, for me, it's my truth. But then how do I react and work with people that have a totally black and white difference, and it's like, really, how do we stay in loving kindness and compassion with those people, but also with anybody? And so I just thought you were masterful in that sharing, and I took notes, and I'm going to share them. So I thank you very much. It was really, really important, especially in this day and age.
I appreciate what was just said. About the day and age and turning and challenging things, clarifying things, and helping us all get different perspectives and understanding. It seemed to me like when Chris was talking about rotating an object that you've created with some degree of gratitude and respect and affection even, and great deal of prior thought. And then when you turn it and rotate it, and then you turn it upside down, like you were mentioning, turning it upside down, that's interesting because it's like taking a Buddhist statement, a teaching, and asking now, what if the opposite is true? What would it mean if the opposite of what the Buddha said is true? And so to think of it from that perspective helps you challenge your perhaps attachments, because we, out of reverence and love for something, we're very afraid to really issue a challenge. We feel like we're being disrespectful, ungrateful. But really, if you turn something upside down, what if someone said the opposite of this? And if you have the courage to look at it, you'll actually eventually discover that what the Buddha said was true. And in fact, by turning it upside down, or challenging it, or questioning it, you actually enhance your capacity to really understand it. You don't understand it simply by believing it. You understand it by looking at it, as Kirk was saying, from different perspectives. And I truly believe that even on the physical plane, when you take something and rotate it and look at it, and your response to it, your subjective response to it, but you take time and you turn it back around, you actually are not seeing the same object. It is not the same object because it's not the same state of mind. Because having turned something, having turned over beliefs, having questioned beliefs, having asked people to give their thoughts, your mind is not the same. You've actually changed, and that's why in time your perceptions change, because you've gone through a rotation of mind, and it's going to make a difference as to what you actually perceive, feel, and how you regard something. So I think all that's been said is really quite beautiful, and I love the way Chris did that. I think it's a wonderful analogy, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, you don't have something you could show us in your room there that you've done?
Yeah, hang on. So these are some, they're lanterns for tea light candles. But so I make these, and they're small and easy to buy, and they're a thing I have on hand, and they're based on a piece of coral that I found on the beach.
Yeah.
And So unfortunately, I only have very small things here right now. Everything else is tied up in galleries that are currently closed due to the coronavirus epidemic. But so this is another piece. This was actually fired using a technique called raku, which is a Japanese firing technique that was developed out of the tea ceremony as a way to give pieces a sense of, I don't know if you're familiar with the term wabi-sabi, but it's the Japanese aesthetic phrase that talks about the timelessness of the visual characteristics of the timelessness of a piece. So raku is a very specialized firing process. It's a lot of fun because there's a lot of fire involved and smoke, and it's very dramatic. But so this piece is based on another piece of coral. So I've been working on coral a lot because of an exhibition I'm working towards. But this is based on fungi coral. I don't know if it's a little hard to see the details, but I don't know. You probably have seen fungi coral on the beach. That makes these beautiful, almost like umbrella shapes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. Both the pieces are remarkable. And the color looks very sort of iridescent as well. That's not something easily achieved, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, that also is specific to, I have some much more iridescent ones, but they are in a box at the moment. Sorry about that. But the raku process, that sort of metallic iridescence is one of the things that it really does pretty well because of the specifics of the atmospheres when you're firing it and then doing a process called reduction, which is taking the oxygen out of the atmosphere, and that brings out the metallic iridescent hues.
So the first one you showed looked like it was a series of small rings that were then placed together to make that bowl shape. Is that right?
This one.
Yeah. Or how did you make that? What was the process of making that?
So I do this, so my process is basically that I find a object in the natural world that is appealing to me for whatever reason. I think that they have certain aesthetic qualities that I really enjoy. And then I try and take that and push it a little further. So in this case, this particular pattern is a pattern you see everywhere in nature once you start looking. It's called close packed cells, and it's sort of a miracle of bioengineering. It has the highest strength to material ratio imaginable, and like you see it in your cells, you see it in the way soap bubbles form, you see it in the way mud cracks. But the technique itself that I use is it's all piercing. So I make a form that is this basic shape. It's just a solid, not a solid, but it's like a cup. And I use a sharpened, this is highly technical, by the way. I use a sharpened stick. I started out using a pencil, but I've gotten much better at sharpening them and getting the very specific qualities of the stick that I want. And then it's just a matter of pressing the stick in and piercing, and then working as I go around the piece. There's a particular aspect of this type of pattern that I love, which is repetition with variation. So the miracle of the sharpened stick is that it will create a different hole of a different size depending on how far you push it in, and so that will create an infinite number of different sized holes, which is one of the characteristics of natural forms. Is although they have there's a structure to the geometry, the expression of the geometry often has all of these little variations, because nature is trying to make something perfect, but the process of becoming for a natural object is full of outside influences and other things that affect the process. So it's never quite perfect. There's There's never a totally even pattern. If you look at machine-made patterns, they're uniform, whereas a natural pattern is never uniform.
Well, just another connection that was coming to mind as you were talking is, in one sense, you could think about all these great traditions that we've been looking at as being different viewpoints, as Renee was mentioning, of truth. It's an attempt to approach the deeper truths of nature, you could say. And it appears like your sculpture is not exactly a replication of nature, but it's almost like an enhancement of it, because you're also bringing the human element to it, the human element of thought, appreciation, of creation, of something that resembles nature but also has another function to it. And it's interesting because in the Buddhist tradition, there's a very elaborate philosophy, right? And like in the Mahayana tradition, they say that the Tibetan books that compose the entire tradition is like the equivalent of 30 or 40 Bibles. And so it has an enormous scope, but in essence, the philosophy itself at a certain point is described as like a boat that one uses to travel on, but then one has to step off at a certain point, right? In order to actually reach the truth, you have and reach the other shore, you have to get off the boat. And so that it's that no matter how fine the philosophy is, no matter how beautiful and magnificent it is, it's not going to be the truth itself. It's a map that points towards the truth, but it's not the truth itself. And that truth we have to encounter, we have to become, right? That's part of the process, the Buddhist process of the Eightfold Path, is eventually becoming that truth. And then in a sense, the philosophy is transcended, So anyway, it was just connecting your appreciation for, your wonder, your love for what you see in nature, and trying to bring it alive in a new way through sculpture. To me, there's kind of a similarity there.
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very well put. I appreciate that. I don't often talk about this when I'm talking about my work, but it's for me personally, it's a very meditative spiritual experience. So the things I deliberately choose a technique and things that take a long time to make and require a lot of sitting down with the hands occupied and the mind is free. I need to, like, for example, on something like this, I make things that are much, much larger, but you can't really make a mistake. You have to, you just have to keep going and be in the right state and have a focused sense of what you're doing, but not worrying too much about it. And I also have a very pleasant place under my house in my backyard where I do my work. So sometimes I think most of this stuff is just an excuse to be in that state, be in that place and be in that state, and listen to the birds. And, I live along the Nu'uanu stream, so I can hear the stream burbling. And so, yeah, I feel like doing this is not only a sort of an experience that is spiritual feeling to me, but also it gives me a huge, enormous appreciation of the natural world and the systems, the complex, beautiful, interwoven systems in the natural world.
Well, they look like things that you might find on the beach. So.
That's good. That's what I like that. Some pieces I will often add what I call an intrusion, which is I will make something that looks very natural, but in order to sort of, I don't know, give it a little more life, I will put an element in that is at odds with what's going on in the piece, that gives a little visual tension or conceptual tension. And usually that's something that's a little more machine-made than looking than natural. That gives me the tension that I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think in terms of what you were just saying about, Chris, about the kind of spiritual experience, and what Kirk was referring to in terms of the ideal, and reaching the shore where it becomes real. It reminds me of the contrast between, say, Leonardo da Vinci, because Michelangelo, as I understand it, would speak about seeing a particular piece of marble, and in that particular piece, he suddenly felt an attraction and then an appeal by the spirit within the marble, so to speak, calling out to him. So he then became engaged in trying to release the spirit, so to speak, within the marble by his sculpting. There was a kind of beautiful kind of communion, you might say, that took place between the vision it awoke in him when he saw its potential and what he then actually sculpted out of it with great painstaking care and also great appreciation of it. Then you have a Leonardo who often, apparently, would begin a painting and then our sculptor, and then in time would withdraw from it because it was so beneath the level of the ideal that he could conceive of, that he felt that his efforts were falling too far short. And so he left it, many incomplete things. Now, what it reminds me of is something that Mary might appreciate. I had a student in class, and it was in, I think it was either Eastern or Western religion, I don't know. But she told me she was going to miss a class because she was flying to the Philippines. And she's a Christian, and she was going to meet, while she was there, she was going to be friends, meet some fellow Christians. Well, a week passes, she comes back to class, she said, I just have to tell you, now I understand why philosophy is important in relation to so many things. And I didn't realize it was relevant to Christianity. She said, when I got to the Philippines, to Manila, I ended up with 4 or 5 students. And what did we do? They let me into their circle, and I have never had a more intensive 4 days of examining the New Testament. Every one of, and they were all women, they went through every word of a passage and questioned it. What do you think Christ might have meant? What does this word mean? And they, by the time we got through it, it was like I had a kind of spiritual experience through the intellectual. And I began to realize how many layers of depth of potential meaning there was in the statements of Jesus. And it just took me completely away from my church or any kind of sect at all. I was able to experience what it must mean to really understand something from the inside out and have a sense of being elevated by it. So by the time I left, those ladies like myself, I realized I'd had a concentrated, accelerated experience within a 4-day or 5-day period of time that was far vaster than anything I'd had for many years of going to the church and hearing things in belief. I actually explored them. And these ladies are just so dedicated to what they're doing. It was just like sculpting. something came out of it so beautiful that I'll just never forget. And now I know there's just so many ways of looking at it. And it doesn't subtract from you at all. It doesn't weaken your beliefs at all. You become far more convinced of the dynamic spirit of the teachings of Jesus. In her case, the teaching of Jesus. Someone else, the teaching of the Buddha. But to me, this is just a beautiful kind of example of coming to the ideal through really being dedicated to painstakingly try to build something like you do with your sculpting.
Yeah, and it strikes me in this case also, it was you were being exposed to a different viewpoint, a very in-depth viewpoint.
Yes, exactly.
Right, and that just it can only help give some perspective on whatever else it is that you're thinking about.
Well, what was interesting, that's a good point. It was a collective experience. It became a kind of community, a mini community that they built right there through their dedication and their desire to, and their love of the example and the life and the teachings of Jesus. And so they experienced it by their questioning their different points of view, but it was something transcendent about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Chris, in your study of nature, because that's what it appears like you're doing with your sculpture, in trying to reproduce natural objects to some degree, do you have the sense at times that of like like a divine sort of impress on nature, on natural life? Do you feel like there's you could say like a higher form of design that's impressing itself, a kind of a higher intelligence impressing itself on nature? Or what is your view on that?
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't say a higher intelligence is sort of a really loaded word, but the process of life is just extraordinary, and so what is it? It's so interconnected and complex, and yeah, I mean, to me, everybody has their I would say that the idea of the life in the natural world is my God, in that it's the spirit that seems to guide everything, or determines everything, or shapes everything.
That's an interesting question. There's a great physicist recently died in his 90s, Freeman Dyson. He was also just a brilliant mathematician. He went into physics because he said he realized by the time he was in his early 20s, there was only about 3 people in the world that was understanding what he was writing about in mathematics. And so there wasn't any point continuing in mathematics. So he decided to switch to where the action was, which was physics. And then he ended up explaining a lot of theories of various very brilliant physicists, Feynman and others, by using mathematics that he understood. And he made their theories more credible in physics. But he himself said near the end of his life that after studying the atom and after studying so much of physical science, he could only conclude that there were 3 levels of intelligence in the universe. The atom, man, and an intelligence that he said, call it the world's soul. You can call it what you wish. The name isn't the point. The point is there is a cosmic intelligence that impresses itself in this most wonderful, complex, and creative ways, but things are harmonic in some way. And you've had now other scientists say, the way we now understand the physical world, you could just as easily say there is a guiding intelligence of some kind involved. You don't have to call it an anthropomorphic God, or you might. But the point is, it's too subtle. It's too finely balanced. It's too intricately interwoven to be chance. So there are those who come out and say, I have no problem with someone saying there's some kind of intelligence that's cosmic. If you don't want to call it higher, but some intelligence. That's a wonderful intelligence. It's not a cold intelligence. It's a very harmonic, beautiful, sonic, symphonic intelligence that makes this world so variegated and so intriguing and so beyond the plausible and magical. So I think that sounds cool.
The phrase that we have translated is right view. And then that to me seems so static when we could be using the phrase right viewing. Like, how do we view? And I wondered if you have anything to say about that.
From my perspective, it's interesting that I don't, when I'm, my point about it's the same object, but it can appear totally different depending on the circumstances and the time, that there is no right view, but there is, but right viewing makes sense to me because it's a process. It's that there's not a single object sitting in front of you. It's many possible objects depending on who you are and what angle you're looking at it from. So the idea that there's a truth or a single thing just doesn't seem to make sense, at least from my basic experience.
And the way that Jim was describing how you're turning up something upside down, leaving it, coming back, asking somebody else, by the time you get back to that piece, you have so transformed yourself that you are viewing it in a completely new way.
Yeah, and it's amazing how easy it is to get yourself in the way of seeing the thing. That just happens almost immediately. The more you start looking at something.
But you see, you're also indicating that there is a right way in a sense. Because if you can say, I'm not seeing something about this is bothering me, something's disturbing me, it's blocking me from seeing it. Now I see it. Now I see it more clearly than I did before. That implies there is something. It's not completely relative. The analogy they give is if you say, you put a lamp, just a lantern in the middle of a table. And there are people all around the table, right? They make a circle around the lamp in the middle of the table, okay? And you put a blue cloth over the lamp. You light the lamp, turn off the lights in the room. Everyone is looking at the same object, right? Correct? We're looking at the lamp. The light is filtered blue, but every person who's sitting around the table is looking at that, perceiving that lamp, experiencing that lamp from a particular angle, from a particular point of view, correct? Mm-hmm. So each one is seeing the same thing, quote unquote, but they're seeing it from a slightly different point of view. Mm-hmm. Now, what is interesting, of course, because there is a light there. That light is filtered through a cloth. You change the color of the cloth, you change what you're perceiving. But nonetheless, there's still an interest. Now, what is interesting, you can say, well, if there are 10 people around the table and there are 10 points of view of that lamp, each would give a slightly different description depending on the angle and distance from which they're sitting. But as you say, okay, now everybody get up and rotate chairs. If you rotate chairs, now you're going to see the object. It's still the same object, quote unquote, but now you're seeing it from a slightly different perspective, right? You can do this mentally. You can do this mentally by asking yourself, if I were in that seat, how would I look at this? And trying your best to use your imagination to understand. Or you can have a conversation. How are you seeing it? So through conversations, we learn to see things through different eyes. We come back, we still see the same object, quote unquote, but now we see it in a rich, multifaceted way. And somehow we intuitively integrate it, synthesize it, and still it becomes our point of view. It's our point of view, but now it's composed of many points of view that have been integrated into one. And it still allows further discoveries, but there's still one thing. Interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
Aloha, everybody.
Aloha, Malia.
Aloha, Christopher. Thank you so much for sharing about your art and about especially looking at it from different points of view. That's something that really speaks to me as a hula dancer and as a hula teacher and a hula choreographer, because the experience of hula to me is very much like a kaleidoscope, where we have to have some awareness of our song and the meaning of our song so that we can convey the story. And yet we're encouraged to have our own point of view, a memory, say for dancing about a mountain, that we have our memory of a mountain together with the awareness of the hula dancers in our line, together with our understanding of, yeah, like kind of the poetic meaning. So it really is a process to me of shifting back and forth constantly between many different points of view. And so I think that that what you said about your art, even looking at it upside down, it can bring so much insight. So I just wanted to thank you for bringing that up, because I think that that speaks to me really clearly.
Let me just add one more aspect to this discussion. That is this idea about, we talk about intuition, which people understand that word and the meaning of that word in many different ways, but in these ancient traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism, there's a whole process by which one moves the mind towards that ability to see things directly. So it's like a direct viewing that's also a fusion. They talk about it as being like a fusion of subject and object. And I mentioned this last time, but it's where all those filters that divide us from seeing things as they are dissolved, and you're absorbed. So you're absorbed in the nature of the object itself. It's like you're seeing it from the inside, and all of those relative viewpoints and perspectives, although they're helpful and they may help their steps in moving towards that direct understanding, but none of them encompass that direct understanding. And in fact, it's said that that those great seers, that's one of the words that's used for the great adepts, the great rishis of ancient India, for example, is they're seers, and that's because they have developed a capacity to pierce all of those veils between the eye, the sense of eye, the limited sense of eye, in nature itself. So there's a direct scene, a direct confrontation with things as they are. And but then it's also said that they can't express that to another person, no matter how eloquent they are, no matter how learned they are. They can only suggest what that experience is like. So that kind of, in my mind, that kind of reinforces what Jim was saying. We have to affirm that a human being can directly see and know the truth, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to tell you and I about it in a way that we would understand it and say, oh yeah, now I see the truth too. No, because each person has to make that journey, right?
We have only a couple minutes left, and I would love to hear any reflections from anyone who hasn't yet taken the opportunity to speak. I want to let you know, floor is open to you.
I'll say, just as I'm hearing everybody talking, and I'm kind of in the background doing a few other things as well, but just hearing bits and pieces, it made me think, Renee, and I don't know if you already shared this with the GEMS group last week, or if you watched the show afterwards about the nuns and the story you shared in our meeting about how we kind of have this idea of what a nun views as a right view or a wrong view. And, you know, they have their beliefs and their morals. And then you shared that story, and I don't know if you want to, you know, kind of share it again, how you even yourself had this idea of what she would think of the situation, and then for her to have a completely different view on it, being open-minded and compassionate. So that's what came to mind for me, hearing everybody talking about right and wrong view, or taking something and moving it around and shifting it. And so I thought of that story. I don't know if you want to share, but.
Sure. This is the British BBC production called Call the Midwife. And it's a collection of nuns and nurses. The nuns also are nurses, and then they have younger counterparts who haven't taken vows or anything. And they're working in a very, very poor section of London in the 1950s. And the story that Kendra is reminding me of is of a brother and sister who long ago had lost both of their parents, and as orphans had been sent to a workhouse. In fact, she was sent to one workhouse and he was sent to another, one for the girls and women and one for the boys and men. And as they were being torn from one another and sent in their different directions, he promised her, as the older brother, that he would someday find her and that they would be back together again. And the workhouses were evidently really horrific places, and people did not always survive them. The two of these children had the strength to survive the workhouses, and he eventually did find his sister. By the time we see them, they're in their 60s, it looks like, and they're so close, and it turns out he is dying of cancer. You see them talking to the nurses. Each of them wants to protect the other from knowing that the man is dying of cancer. He doesn't want his sister to know because she'll be too distraught, and she doesn't want him to know. They're really very close and very protective of one another. Well, at one point, while the nurses are visiting him to help address his health needs, she goes into the bedroom of the small house and finds out there's only one bedroom and there's only one bed. And she's really aghast by what the implications of that are. She goes back to where they live at the end of her taking care of him that day, and she's chattering to all her fellow nurses, the midwives. They do nursing as well as the other kind of midwiving, and chatter, and this is incest, and what do you think of that? And then over on the side, there's this older nun who has been there for so long, and she knew about the whole story of this brother and sister. And she just came over to the group of young women and said, you know, when the two of them went into the workhouses, they lost all family. There was no family left whatsoever. And when they found each other, they were finding beloveds. They have not been able to live without each other. They're the most important person in each other's lives. This is something different. And she just viewed the whole situation with such an overriding compassion that would cut through the outside appearance of things. That she just showed to me a much higher perspective than the judgmentalism and thinking they knew things of the little nuns. And actually often in that show, there's a higher perspective taken than what conventional viewpoints might point to. So,
what's the show again?
It's called Call the Midwife. Call the Midwife.
All right.
It's a BBC production that's excellently produced. I feel as if they take a very Shakespearean approach to their character development. And by that, I mean that they look at each character, we as the audience gets views of all of these characters from a number of different viewpoints. Nobody is all right. Nobody has a perfect character, and nobody is completely flawed. We get to see a very rounded perspective on each character and their humanity. Chris, I feel as if you've rounded our perspective immensely by sharing something that you have given so much of your heart energy to, your thought to, your creativity to, and really enriched us through that gift. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. It was, a lot of what I heard, I plan on digesting and seeing how I can fold it back into what I do. But I like that description of a seer, and it's interesting that they can't tell you what they see.
That is
one of the analogies it's giving, it's like they can point to the moon, but it's not the same as looking at the moon. You know, we look at the finger and say, oh, there's the truth, but the finger is not the truth. It's the moon that's the truth, and we got to look at that.
Right.
But Chris, I had one other request. Can you share some more images of stuff you've done? Because I really like what I saw. I'd love to see more.
Yeah, I have a website. It's ChristopherEdwards.net.
Okay, great. We'll check it out.
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff on there and pictures and everything. So,
great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you later. Aloha.
Aloha.
Chris.
Aloha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Aloha.